Hello and welcome to another session of Business Tech Talks. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Jim Higgins and I head up business development for IT Solutions. I'll be presenting today's Business Tech Talk session along with a special guest, Vin Pham, Partner Manager at Duo. Today's webinar is titled Rethinking Security in an Era of Advanced Threats. Just a quick background on Business Tech Talks for any first-time attendees. BTT is a webinar series sponsored by a group of nationally recognized managed services providers. All of our members provide comprehensive network management and support solutions in different regions across the U.S. Our goal is to further educate business executives and IT professionals, as well as our clients, about key industry topics. We share our knowledge and best practices in order to promote innovation, growth, and success. For more information on any of the BTT sponsors, as well as past recordings of other webinars, visit our website at businesstechtalks.com. Of course, anytime during the webinar, you can submit your questions, and we'll save some time at the end to circle back and answer what we can for you. Anything that we don't cover in the session, we'll go ahead and send out an email to the attendees with responses to those questions. Just a little bit on my company, IT Solutions, before we jump into the main content. ITS has been around for 24 years. We started business in 1994, and we service about 250 clients. Our specialties include managed network services, cloud hosting, and custom application development. The industry focus for IT Solutions are in three areas: legal, financial services, and healthcare. But we have clients across spectrum of different vertical markets, and we support a variety of small and medium-sized business customers headquartered in and around Philadelphia. At ITS, we like to say we have long-term clients without long-term contracts. Over 20% of our client base has been with us for more than 10 years, and all of our managed services clients are in a 90-day evergreen contract. We don't require clients to sign up for anything longer than 90 days at a time. So we like to say we're only as good as our last 90 days. We are consistently proving our value and worth to our clients every 3 months. At ITS, we have strong partnerships with industry-leading tech security companies like our friends from Duo, and along with the other companies that are part of Business Tech Talks and a number of other similar national companies, we are part of a managed services practices peer group. And we use that influence of that group to bring best of breed and best practices to all of our clients in our different markets. So let's talk a little bit about some background on the evolution of security and cybercrime. 10 years ago, when we gave this presentation, we were talking primarily about on-premise networks and what was needed in terms of security. We talked about things like antivirus and anti-spam, a firewall, and then, of course, having backups in case of a server crash or natural disaster. And that was pretty much the extent of what we talked about in those much simpler times. But today, the landscape is much different. And of course, the way people work has changed dramatically. Most people can work from anywhere and almost any device. They leverage cloud-based environments and applications on a regular basis. They bring their own devices to work. And of course, the Internet of Things is growing day by day, becoming more and more prevalent. All of this has created more holes and more opportunity to make cybercrime easier than ever before. Even just a few years ago, when we talked about cybersecurity, we were mostly talking about enterprises in specific markets: financial services, healthcare, government. That pretty much encompassed the majority of the data breaches we saw. But in 2018, as you could see in the chart on this slide, those three industries now only make up about half of the breaches, and cyber criminals have moved on to other industries like manufacturing, retail, and hospitality. Back then, we used to have finance hacker organizations overseas, but today it's a whole new ecosystem. They can buy and host virtual machines anywhere in the world. They can specialize in different areas. It's getting cheaper and cheaper to do, and they can go after smaller and smaller targets. At this point, it's become an industry of its own. So criminals have basically moved down the stack away from the enterprises, or in addition to the enterprises, to also go after small and medium-sized businesses, which makes up most of our client base, that maybe don't have proper security in place or the budget required to protect against all these new ways of intrusion. We say it all the time, hackers do not discriminate. So, what's the number one cause of a data breach? Believe it or not, it's human error. And one of the most common ways that we get tricked as humans is through what we call phishing or spear phishing or whaling. So phishing, just to be specific, is an attack that uses email or malicious websites to solicit personal information by posing as a trustworthy organization. Phishing emails are usually sent in mass quantity to a list purchased from the dark web. As the name suggests, they cast a wide net and they sit and wait for a bite. More specifically, we have something called spear phishing, which is a targeted attack where criminals gather information about you or your peers or friends or loved ones, and they come up with a targeted message to trick you into giving up your information. Getting even more specific, we have something called whaling now. And whaling is a form of impersonation attack that targets high-profile business executives, CEOs, CFOs, controllers. Whaling has spoofed emails that are used to very closely mimic a legitimate email request from a CEO or financial manager, requesting something like a wire transfer or something of this nature. There are a couple things that most phishing attacks have in common. Number one, they take advantage of human error and sometimes, unfortunately, human carelessness. And second, they almost always have a sense of urgency behind them. Whatever the request is, it typically needs to happen right away. So people don't have as much time to think about reacting. How common is phishing? Well, so common that 90% of attacks today start with a phishing email. So it's critical to educate your users about phishing threats at all levels. Think about how much time we spend working in email. It's the number one application for just about everybody. It makes it a no-brainer for cyber criminals to focus their efforts here. Malware. Malware is a pretty broad term and can come in many forms. As the name suggests, it's malicious software that gets downloaded onto your machine, usually without your knowledge. Malware can perform a variety of functions, including stealing, encrypting, or deleting sensitive data, altering or hijacking core computing functions, and monitoring users' computer activity without their permission. One of the most common ways to get malware on your machine today is through malicious ads, which is also called malvertising. Malvertising typically takes a copy of a legitimate ad, posts it to the web, and then creates a fake website that tricks you into entering your information. Once you click the ad, the trouble starts. And just like that, you're compromised. Ransomware. Ransomware has been a particularly frustrating and costly form of cybercrime in recent years. Ransomware is designed to infect a company's network and encrypt data. Once in your system, perpetrators demand a ransom payment, typically via Bitcoin because of its untraceable profile, in exchange for decrypting the system's data. If you're compromised by ransomware, typically you can avoid significant damage and downtime by having reliable, up-to-date backups of all your data. This goes for both cloud-based and on-premise applications and systems. At IT Solutions, we have an additional layer of protection that we bring to our clients to mitigate the trouble with ransomware. And what we do is we're able to stop an attack in its tracks if it happens to make its way through, getting there before you have to go to backup. So this is a screen you hopefully will never have to see other than in this webinar. This is an example of a notification you would get if you were under attack by ransomware. And again, fortunately, it's only for illustration purposes and not the real thing. Cryptocurrency mining malware. That is a mouthful. But what it is is relatively simple. Attackers infect a PC, a server, a smartphone, or even an Internet of Things connected device with malware. And then they secretly use the processing power to mine for cyber currency. What started out in mid-2011 has evolved into an effective way to profit on cyber espionage and ransomware. Even organized hacking groups are joining the bandwagon. Recently, the popular file-sharing website Pirate Bay, which is used to share copyrighted material, ran a Bitcoin miner as an alternative to ads to generate funds for the business. This is a good reminder why you should steer clear of these types of online outlets. Last but not least, we can't forget inside threats and something called shadow IT. While our employees are our biggest assets, they can also be one of our biggest threats, usually more through carelessness than malicious behavior. So it goes without saying that you need to know who has access to your network at all times, including not just employees, but third-party vendors, consultants, and the like. Shadow IT is defined as products or services that are on your network without consent or knowledge of management. Some typical examples would be an employee who leverages a file-sharing software such as Dropbox to make their jobs easier, or someone who might try to set up a wireless access point plugged into your network and you don't know about it, so it's not protected, it's not locked down. Or one of the most common ones we see is where an employee or an outsider might set up a software as a service account without permission from corporate IT or the knowledge of where it is being hosted. Any of these actions could compromise your network and, in a worst case, open you up to a breach of critical and confidential business data. So now that we've covered most of the more common threats we're seeing today, let's talk about some best practices. At IT Solutions, our best practice vehicle is something we call ITSecure. With ITSecure, and with any good security practice or process, we look at it as a multi-layer approach to security. And there are a number of standard ways to keep things protected. At the base level, every business, large or small, should have the following levels of protection: spam filtering, anti-malware, antivirus, lockdown of ports and firewalls, and a strong password policy requiring regular updates. Last but certainly not least, don't forget backups. As I said earlier, whether your network is on-premise or in the cloud, you need reliable, effective backup solutions that you can test and verify on a regular basis. Typically recommended at least minimum at a quarterly basis, testing all backup to make sure everything is working properly. Let's talk about some advanced layers of protection. As I said, all of IT Solutions clients are covered by what we call ITSecure in the previous slide. But we have an add-on package called ITSecure Plus that more and more of our clients are moving to now as threats become more common and there are more options in the marketplace at more attractive prices. Other companies within the Business Tech Talk Consortium offer similar services, and I'd encourage you, if you're one of their clients, to reach out to ask them about what additional type of security they're doing. At ITS, we have 10 different threat protectors that we include with ITSecure Plus. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into the details on all these. I'm just going to cover a few of the ones that are more popular and more, I think, more important in terms of what they cover. And the multi-factor authentication, number 10, will be covered by our friend Vin when I hand over the webinar to him. So web and content filtering. This blocks users from accessing harmful sites. For example, sites that are known for malvertising. You could set up location-aware policies, custom blocks, and allow filters. Mobile device management, MDM. Especially as it relates to bring your own device, you can create a protected container for company data apart from personal data, even on employee-owned mobile devices. You can selectively wipe the container, and you can protect against screenshots of sensitive data that people might try to take. Number 5, vulnerability and risk assessment. We have tools and processes to identify all externally facing assets, and we scan them for vulnerabilities. This involves probing websites, applications, operating systems, and device configurations with the goal of gaining access to protected data. An ideal way to determine what weaknesses may be present in your IT infrastructure and prioritize your next steps to combat it. This is also a good way to identify any shadow IT instances, like we talked about earlier, going on in the organization. Another popular one for the ITS clients is phishing training, number 9 there. This is popular, and we have tools in place to determine your weakest links. We'll send out fake phishing emails to your staff to help educate the user base. We'll be able to see who clicked what and use the results for training to help prevent being compromised if a real attack were to occur. Before I hand it over to Vin, just a few takeaways from our portion of the webinar today. Number 1, cybercrime is a rapidly growing industry and is always evolving. Traditional network security practices cannot promise total protection. Email is still the number 1 vehicle of cyber attack, as we discussed when we were talking about phishing. You should always be evaluating your risks and determining advanced or additional levels of protection, like we talked about with the ITSecure Plus offerings. Cybersecurity requires multi-level, policy-driven practices, and it is a board or executive level priority that requires regular review and attention. So we like to say that cybersecurity is not just the responsibility or purview of your IT department or IT manager or your consultant, but that it goes to the highest levels of management in your organization and should be constantly being reviewed and updated for best practice. And finally, educate your end users. All the companies within BTT have developed policies and procedures for doing end user training. We at ITS do lunch and learns and can set them up at our clients' requests, as well as putting the tools in place, as we talked about earlier, such as phishing training, to help educate. So just reach out to your VCIO or me at any point, and we'd be happy to talk to you about how we can educate your end users. All right, so that is it for the IT Solutions portion of today's webinar. We'll be back on here at the end to answer a couple questions. But at this point, I'm going to go ahead and move the control over to Vin and let him take it away. So just give us a second here on that.
Hey everyone, thanks Jim. Appreciate the introduction there. Hey everyone, my name is Vin and I'm a partner manager here at Duo Security. First and foremost, just want to thank IT Solutions for inviting me to co-host the webinar today and just really bring a broader awareness to security as a whole. And secondly, I'd like to thank you, the attendees, for taking time out of your busy schedule to attend. Today, what I'm going to do is lead us through a thoughtful conversation around practicing effective security in a world where remote access is an absolute necessity. My hope, my goal, is that we leave the conversation today with some actionable takeaway items that will make us a little bit more secure than heading into the presentation. But before I dive into the meat of the content, let me give you a lens to who we are, Duo, as a company and as a product. So we're a cybersecurity company based out of Ann Arbor, Michigan. Go Blue for any of you alum that might be listening in. And we currently have about 700 employees today. We also have offices outside of Ann Arbor, Michigan, located in London, Austin, Texas, and San Mateo, California. And about 8 years ago in 2010, we were co-founded by Doug Song and John Oberheide, who both have an extensive background in security. Doug, our CEO, is formerly the co-founder of Arbor Networks, formerly the chief cloud architect at Barracuda Networks, and John was our CTO and a renowned security researcher at the University of Michigan. And with that said, we were launched as a company with a core belief that's different than many other security companies in the industry. And that core belief is that security is most effective when it's easy to use. We believe that the easier that you can make security, the more your end users are going to embrace it and the less they're going to push it away. And this philosophy is really at the foundation of everything that we do, and it really has to be present for every solution that we roll out as a company. So that being said, I'm not going to focus too much about our product, but really overview how we all together can practice effective security in an era of remote access. In order to have that conversation, we need to take a look at the current landscape and really just the anatomy of what a modern day breach looks like. So you and we've all been through it before. Way too often we kind of wake up in the morning and we read the news and we're scratching our heads again saying, how did another breach just happen, right? And in reality, it's just really never the way the mainstream media or Hollywood tends to portray it, right? Really, if you think about it, the likelihood of Tom Cruise dropping through your ceiling or dark ominous hacker sitting there, with cohorts in a van, looking out for them in a nearby parking lot to keep an eye out. It's really just not real life, right? It makes money for the mainstream media in Hollywood, but that's really about it. But more importantly, thinking about security in this type of lens, it's not going to help us become more secure than we are today. The reality is attackers are actually the complete opposite. They can be often very lazy and they focus to attack at scale to breach your organization rather and through a path of least resistance. They don't prefer to repel through a roof or devise some sort of complicated plan for years on years on years for a targeted attack. They rather take advantage of the weaknesses that are already in place within your organization because, one, they're easy to exploit, and two, they offer the most return on investment for the time that they're going to put into something. So as Jim mentioned before, let's highlight a few things that attackers do prefer, right? First, out-of-date software. To Jim's point around malware before, it's easy for an attacker to deliver malware at scale to a mass population through out-of-date software, and it doesn't have to even leverage the latest zero-day. In fact, Duo, we rarely see attackers burn a zero-day, and what I mean by that is through a targeted network-based attack. To clarify, exploit kits definitely contain 0 days, but if you think about it, that's not even necessary. If you think about the number of organizations out there, the number of end users each organization has, and then you multiply that by the number of devices each end user leverages, someone is bound to be out of date enough. And on top of that, more organizations are slow at patching. And with that, because there's so many devices in the mix now, some organizations aren't even aware of the devices to patch. Secondly, of course, not to be repetitive, but to reiterate the point, there's phishing, right? The most common form of attack, but the message here is phishing has evolved. It's no longer your stereotypical email with poor grammar and misspellings everywhere. Attackers have gotten more sophisticated in this arena. They've evolved, right? And even to the level where they can trick trained professionals, those that focus on this type of attack day to day, to give up their credentials. So common ways that this is accomplished is either changing a domain name by one character, spoofing an email from a C-level member of the organization to create credibility, things along those lines. And lastly, drive-by type of attacks, right? Jim kind of hit on this a little bit earlier as well. This is where a user is lured to a website, something malicious is executed in the background, and it's using an exploit like an out-of-date plugin like Adobe Flash, Silverlight, Java, and the user's not even aware that something's running in the background. So to reiterate here, to have a takeaway on this slide, most attackers are generally lazy and they rely on human error to steal their data. Put yourself on both sides of the equation here. So think about yourself as a defender of an organization, right? I have to be concerned about every entry point into my organization, and it's just a broad attack surface to safeguard. Whereas if I'm attacking an organization, if all I have to do is deploy an attack at scale, find that one area that's not being defended as well as the others, and that's it. I'm successful. So it's not always that the attacker's smarter, it's just that they can be more successful through scaling their attacks. And so as we've gone through what the anatomy of a modern day breach looks like, I want to walk through a real life example that kind of shows what an easy scalable attack can do. And what I'll bring up today is the hack of John Podesta's emails. This has actually come back into the news quite recently based on the mainstream headlines. So as the story goes, March 19th, 2016, an attacker sends phishing emails to various members of the Clinton campaign. Now, those phishing emails go out, but most of them actually bounce back because they were sent to individuals who no longer worked on the campaign. However, because this was done at scale, the phishing email did make it to one person, and that person was very important. That person was John Podesta, who at the time was the campaign chairman for Hillary Clinton. And the attacker impersonated Google, letting John know that his account had been compromised by someone in Ukraine being purposely chosen to spark some sort of emotional desire to read the email a bit further. And the attacker also provided a mass link that was poisoned for John to change his password. Now, to John's credit, he sent the email to his IT team where they reviewed it and they confirmed that it was legitimate that he needed to change his password. In their response, they sent a valid link to John to change his password through accounts.google.com, and they also asked them to turn on two-factor authentication. But that's it. The damage was already done, no matter what the response was. John actually submitted his password reset through the poison link that was originally sent to him, and you all know how the story goes from here. The rest is pretty much history. Thousands of emails accessed, reputational and financial harm followed shortly afterwards. So again, the message here is, this isn't Agent 007 breaking into a data center to steal your data. This is a low-level phishing attack that compromised a very important political figure at the time. And the trend, the message is that with these breaches, attackers are targeting end users and their devices. And the reason why they're doing this is because it's the easiest path into an organization. Users are easily deceived and devices are easily compromised. And the proof is really in the numbers here. So these aren't our numbers, but this is that of the Verizon Data Breach Report, where, if you're not already aware, the Data Breach Report is an industry recognized report that gives us the state of security on an annual basis. And in 2017, we saw that 81% of breaches involved a compromised credential, right? Stolen username and password, weak password. And also, of that, 75% of those breaches, 3/4 of those breaches also involved a compromised device, likely that device being compromised to harness those credentials. So in a world of remote access today, the username and password are keys to your kingdom, and your end users hold those keys. Another number that stood out to me in the Verizon Data Breach Report that's not necessarily on this slide is that 73% of breaches are financially motivated. Not a surprise to anyone, right? But also important to keep things into perspective. An attacker always takes the easiest path into an organization because they're motivated by the same things you and I are, and most people are. How do I get the most return on investment for the time that I'm putting into something? So we understand that attackers are targeting our users and devices, and that a majority of that trend is because users are easy to deceive and devices are easy to compromise. But what about how we're defending our data, right? How have we architected our defense? And is how we architected our defense actually encouraging attackers to target users and devices? So when we look back 10 to 15 years ago, this is kind of what our defense looked like, right? This old moat and castle approach: harden the firewall, harden the perimeter. Everything on the inside of that wall is good and trusted. Everything on the outside of that wall is bad, and we need to keep it out. And there's a reason to that approach, because at the time, 10 to 15 years ago, the insider threat, which was much more prevalent because of where enterprise resources were located, right? If you think about it, mission critical servers, applications, endpoints, they all resided on premise, and end users weren't using remote access nearly as much as they were when they and they were coming into work every day. So as a result, IT administrators architected this type of defense, right? Because they had a much more clear picture of the current state of security in their organization. And what we've seen transform the past decade or so is that the proliferation of cloud-based applications and the introduction of BYO devices, this changes the perimeter that we've all been accustomed to. So what is today's perimeter, right? Well, in short, the way that I would describe it is it's dynamic. It's much less defined. Yes, you still have some of your endpoints, your applications, your servers that reside on premise, but there's enterprise resources that sit outside of your firewall as well. So let's walk through a couple of those. Cloud hosted applications, right? Office 365, Dropbox, Salesforce, things that are not hosted on premise that store critical information. You also have more vendors, contractors, third-party services, even your MSP accessing your information remotely, right? And then at the same time, we live in a world that demands more agility. Your end users, your colleagues, your workers, right? They want to be empowered to work from any device, from anywhere, because they want to be the most productive version of themselves, and rightfully so. But when we sum that all up, the fact that users, applications, and devices have expanded beyond the traditional perimeter, that just translates to a broader attack surface for attackers to work with. And inherently, that means a higher risk of breach. And that means that's a risk of breach that we might not be properly defending for today. So at this point in the webinar, you might be asking yourself, hey, this is pretty simplistic, Vin. I'm not surprised by any of the statistics that you're bringing up. So why haven't we solved for this yet? And the answer to that question lies in the state of the industry. First and foremost, security is often perceived to be extremely complicated. If you put yourself in the shoes of someone trying to solve for a security project, you're often faced with a ton of different options, right? And on top of that, we've been conditioned that by the industry to this perception that more security equals better security. And I like to bring up this slide because it's truly indicative and illustrative of what the security landscape looks like today. Where do you really even start? There's over a dozen categories, thousands of vendors. I believe 451's research said that there's over 1,200 security vendors in the space today, right? And it's this complicated maze of products that distract us from the very challenge that we were initially trying to solve for. And then secondly, once we navigate that vendor maze, we often find that security is very hard, right? The vendor that you've chosen or the solution that you've chosen, you often find isn't as expected, right? It's tough to implement, it's tough to roll out, it's tough to support, but most importantly, it leads to a poor end user experience and it decreases the adoption rate of security overall. So going back to the original question, why hasn't this been solved for? And really, I think the answer is pretty straightforward. I think it's because the complexity and the difficulty of the security space makes doing nothing way more convenient and easier than doing something and taking action. And here at Duo, ease of use is one of our core philosophies, right? As I mentioned earlier, and we think that it's not rocket science. We say don't get distracted by the industry and the complexity of their products. Rather, we should all go back to the basics. We should all practice pragmatic security again. So we're going to break this down into 3 different buckets. We're going to talk about users, devices, and applications, but we'll first talk about users, and we'll talk about best security practices from a user standpoint. So first, password managers are a great way to incentivize your users across their applications to use unique passwords and still promote usability. Passportal is a great example of this, I'd say, where each user doesn't need to know every single password to every application. Instead, as an end user, I need to know one strong password to my vault that contains my other strong passwords. There's also the concept of single sign-on, where you can log into any of your cloud applications using the same username and password from a central identity provider like your Active Directory on-premise. Now, it's important to consider that when you consolidate your credentials to a single source of truth, like single sign-on or password managers, you should have a second layer of security for authentication. I call it positive identification. And that's what Duo does, and that's where multi-factor authentication comes into play. Two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication is having a user, your end user, verify something they know, like a username and password, with something they physically have, like a device or a token that they have in hand. And as I mentioned, Duo has a best-in-class product that makes this extremely easy to do. And we've adopted two-factor authentication in our consumer lives already. If you think about an ATM, you walk up to an ATM, you present your debit card, and you also present your PIN, something you know and something you have. Also, when you log into your consumer bank login, it's not by choice for you, but you get a text message that challenges you for something that you have when you go to log in. So it's just translating that to your enterprise live. Third, this sounds basic, but worth emphasizing, manage your user privileges, right? Only give them access to the resources they need and to do their job, and that's it. Don't let your users traverse your application stack or your entire internal network. Lastly, take the phishing threat head on, as Jim mentioned before. I think email monitoring and filtering, plus phishing campaign tools are great bang for your buck security tools. And when you're using them, remember, don't punish your users while you're using them. Help educate them. We've seen personally at Duo that educating your end users what to look out for is more effective than punishing them with a slap on the hand when they fail a phishing drill or something like that. At Duo, we often say that our security team is every single employee at our company because they're the ones that are on the front lines. They're the ones that are receiving the attacks, and they're the ones that should know what to look out for in the event something does happen so that you can effectively respond. Next, we'll talk about devices. As we reviewed before, we're operating in a world with a less defined perimeter. That means you have many different devices accessing your corporate resources, some of which you're aware of, some of which you're probably not aware of. Get visibility of those devices. Jim mentioned before, MDMs are a great way that you can deploy an agent to devices that you own to get insight to them and see what folks are doing. Secondly, to address BYOD, you can also leverage authentication tools to get logging at the authentication level to get insight to devices that you don't know. Duo has an offering in which we focus exactly on BYOD and devices that you don't know about. Getting visibility to the devices that are not part of your organization is equally as important as inventorying the corporate footprint as well. Once you do have the visibility to your devices, remember, basic security hygiene goes a very long way. We're seeing that security now on these various platforms on mobile are becoming built in as opposed to bolt on, right? And we want to make sure that we're asking the right questions so that these devices are accessing our applications with the minimum security standard. So, are those devices, are their operating systems up to date? How does the browser look, right? Are they fully patched up? Are there plugins running? And if so, are those plugins susceptible to drive-by malware? And with those questions in mind, we can prevent devices from being out of date through routine patching schedules. You can significantly lower the likelihood that an attacker is successful through a scaled attack by something as simple as creating a cadence for patching and looking at your authentication logs. Our next suggestion would be around enforcing encryption. You can have strong authentication all day long to a device, but if the hard drive is being pulled out and it can be read, you're weakening the importance of authenticating to that device. And lastly, if you have the concept of corporate issued, owned, and managed devices and also allow for BYOD, treat those devices based on what they're accessing. I wouldn't say that you should eliminate BYOD altogether. That hampers productivity, and we all know how realistic that is with end users, but set robust security policies around what devices can or cannot access your applications. I always leave with the question, should an admin be able to log into this specific environment with a machine that's corporate issued and controlled or BYOD? And lastly, let's focus on the applications that we're protecting, right? When a user goes to authenticate, interrogate if they should be accessing that application. Take things into account like their user profile, their location, as I mentioned before, their device hygiene, and run it through a policy stack before they're allowed to access the application. Log every application login as well, whether it's successful or not. Those authentication logs go a very long way, not only from a compliance standpoint, but from just a pure company security response standpoint. Also, it goes without saying that deploying and supporting software that's easy for you to manage and easy to scale within your practice is a must-have. Trying to support too many applications or every application under the sun, that will often lead to your bandwidth being stretched too thin and you overlooking basic security controls and put you at risk for a breach. Don't extend yourself too thin would be the message there. And hand in hand with that thought is to eliminate software that you or your employees no longer use. The concept's pretty simple here. If you're not accessing or using that data anymore, why leave that attack vector open for another third party to exploit? And lastly, develop your best practices in responding to security incidents so that you're prepared. Jim mentioned this before, but the underpinning to the thought is to have a robust backup solution in place so that if an incident does happen, you can minimize the impact and the downtime to your end users. So we've gone through a lot just now, but I would like to sum it up in a couple of slides and recap with you. We all know the perimeter today is very different than the perimeter that we've been so used to defending over the past decade or two. And the reason for that is because the proliferation of cloud applications and the introduction of more devices into the world. And as a result, attackers are now pivoting and finding the easiest way to steal your data is now by targeting your users and the devices that they hold in hand. But if we all practice pragmatic security, basic security, you can protect your organization's security posture and protect yourself from the most common threats that are out there in the wild. And that's all I have for us today. I really just want to thank you for your time and listening in on our webinar. I hope you found this session helpful. And please, if you do want to continue the security conversation, please reach out to your VCIO at IT Solutions to continue that conversation. They'll partner with us around that. And I'll kick it back over to Jim for some Q&A.
All right, thank you very much, Vin. I know we're over on time here, the allotted scheduled time, but I appreciate people hanging in, and we'll just get to a couple of quick questions here, and anything else that had come in, we'll respond to offline. One question that came in was, is using Dropbox a risk? No, using Dropbox as a corporate solution for a company, if that's a chosen solution, is not necessarily a risk. In fact, it can be a fine solution. What we were getting at there was if it is something that an individual user has set up, or someone has put something together through Dropbox or something similar, and it is not kind of blessed or known by the powers that be or corporate IT, that's when it can be risky, and it's something that we should be aware of. But as as something as a corporate solution, or as something that's known to management and IT, it's perfectly fine. So sorry if we misled you on that particular point. Another question that came through was, there was, I guess, in the announcement that we sent out, there was people were looking for a security cheat sheet that we were going to send. We are going to be sending that out to all registered attendees following the webinar. So you'll have that. It's a little extra document that we put together to help you with some good do's and don'ts, some good takeaways. And if you have additional questions that come out of that, feel free to reach out. Then there was a question for you regarding applications that you typically see multi-factor authentication coupled with. Is that something you can comment on?
Yeah, absolutely. Pretty much any application that's accessible with username and password is probably a candidate for multi-factor authentication. At Duo, what we commonly see the most is remote applications that can be remotely accessed. Common forms of that are like RDP, Microsoft's push to the cloud with Office 365, any sort of VDI gateway that you might have, NetScalers or otherwise, VPN. Those remotely accessible applications, that the only thing that's stopping someone from getting in with is username and password. That's what we see as strong candidates for two-factor authentication.
All right, thanks, Vin. One other question that just came in, I'll address real quick. The session is recorded. When and where will it be available? It'll be on the businesstechtalks.com website. That's our home for all of the webinars. And we'll have that up there for viewing within the next couple of days, probably by the end of the week. So keep an eye out for that. And I think with that, we're going to call it a webinar and wrap up, and just say again how much we appreciate everyone's time. And we appreciate participation from Vin from Duo helping us out. And that is it for today. Thanks again from Business Tech Talks. Take care, everybody.